You're watching VLGA Connect. It's our summer series best of collection where we look back at some of our most watched and most talked about episodes of the 2021 season. In late September, Kathryn Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA, joined me for a conversation with IBAC Deputy Commissioner David Wolff. We talked about the IBAC report into perceptions of corruption and integrity by people who work in local government. And today we're going to talk about this recent IBAC report on perceptions of corruption in local government. This is where IBAC has talked to people who work in the sector to find out their thoughts about this important topic. Indeed it is, Chris. So this is a survey that they also conducted in 2016. So they've conducted a survey in 2019. The respondents were, as you said, the administration of council, so it didn't extend to councillors, although, interestingly enough, the findings from the report do relate to the councillor group, and we can certainly hear more about that when we speak to David. Let's bring him in now. Here's our guest, David Wolff from IBAC. And it is a pleasure, as always, to have David Wolff from IBAC with us on VLGA Connect. Hi, David. Good to see you.
Hi, Chris. How are you? Good to see you again.
Very well, thank you. And we wanted to talk to you about the report that's come out just a little while ago from IBAC, looking at perceptions of people who work in local government on how corruption and integrity, I guess, is handled in the sector. Can you just give us a brief overview of how this report came into being?
So this report is one of our research reports that we issue periodically. It's based on a survey of participants in the local government sector, and the questions we ask relate to what they perceive as corruption risks or real risks within the sector itself. And I think the important point is that the findings of this survey come from people that are in the sector, working in local government, and primarily the administration of local government. So unlike other external surveys, that's coming from within. So therefore, the findings are a real eye-opener for managers and leaders within local government, because it's effectively your people telling you where the risks are. So if I was running a council, I'd be scrutinising this report quite closely to see if it aligns with my risk register and my risk radar.
I know Kathryn's got some questions about some of the findings, but just before we get into that, I note the survey was done in 2019, and we're somewhat on from that, obviously. Should we be putting some sort of a layer across this, considering we've had COVID in between, and does it change the way you view what you're being told at that point in time?
Really good point to make. So yes, the survey was conducted in 2019 and it follows on our 2016 survey. So it updates the information we received from that original one. And you're right, things may well have changed over the last 2 years. We've been in a completely different working environment and service delivery environment for local governments. And in fact, I think in many respects, we've become more localised. So people are more closely connected with their local governments, their local councils, than they were 2 years ago. So it would be very interesting to run the aligning survey right now. And we'll certainly look to run it. I think it's due again for next year, 2022. And so the comparison of the data will be very, very interesting from that perspective.
David, I did note that one of the findings in the report was that respondents perceive councillor conduct to be an area of increasing corruption risk. However, not that there was a perception that council's ethical culture had improved. I wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit for us.
Remiss of me to at the start to say hello, Kathryn, and it's great to see you as well.
Yeah, good to see you, David.
So it's a really good question you raised. So this is the first time the issue of councillor conduct has been brought up by the survey. The initial survey, it wasn't an issue, so it was quite a change from the earlier survey results. And what that does expose is that the two levels within local government. You've got the administration, and you've got the elected representative cohort as well. And often they're intertwined when people talk about local government, but in many cases they're separated because they are quite different in their roles and responsibilities. So as a corruption risk internally, the administrative staff that were surveyed raised this as an issue and felt that there were potential corruption risks for the elected class, the councillors, in the activities they perform. And a lot of that's to do with their interaction with people outside of the business in terms of matters coming before council and potential conflicts of interest in those associations or meetings or engagements they're actually conducted in. it's an interesting point because, again, there is that risk, that ongoing risk. You've got the framework in the legislation that's there to guard against potential risks. There's complications with that in terms of the application of it and understanding of it. But it was interesting, again, that the administrative staff saw this as a potential risk for the sector.
Indeed, and it's certainly not inconsistent with other reviews that are out there. In fact, IBAC is in the process of finalising the Sandon inquiry and, the matters at Casey, which related to some of those external, stakeholder relationships that you just went through. David, how does this report or how will it inform the cultural review process that is currently being led by Local Government Victoria? It's an initiative of Minister Lean, and we've recently heard that they've announced a project team comprising PricewaterhouseCoopers and also 2 academics. Where do you see this report fitting into that?
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, what I might do is answer the last part of your previous question about the ethical health of councils and how the perception was that it's improved between the last 2 surveys. And in fact, we're quite encouraged by that. And we think a lot of that work has that has gone on in that space with the representative bodies, with Local Government Victoria itself and the integrity system as well, that we're seeing a perception that things are improving, which is terrific, which is fantastic. Doesn't mean there's work to there's no more work to be done, but it's a really, really good improvement to see in the data. Going back to where this report has had influence, the review, the cultural review that you've just talked about, this report was certainly one of the key planks in driving that cultural review, and was certainly a reference point in terms of the issues that it's identified. And as I say, they're not really a surprise in terms of the issues, but they're certainly a good start point for any cultural review around the ethical health of the sector.
David, with the information that's come out of this report, I notice you've reported against levels within council organisations, and some of the findings or recommendations are targeted at middle management. Can you talk a bit about why that has particularly risen to the surface for you?
I sort of broke the report up into 2 sections. There's the internal risks and the external risks, and the internal ones are really targeted at that management level, and a couple of issues that come up consistently within the local government sector, and for that matter in the public sector more broadly, is around recruitment and favouritism in those decisions. So that those findings are really targeted at the managers that are involved in the more high volume recruitment, and how that process is managed. So the transparency, the fairness of it, and the communication of it are really, really important. We see it time and again, particularly when you're in more regional and remote areas of Victoria. You've got limited pools of recruits and potential employees. So it's so important the process is run according to the policy for a start. But again, the communication around the recruitment practices is as good as it can be. Because often it's the unknown. It's a role's advertised, and all of a sudden someone arrives, and the process to have that person come on board is not well communicated within the organisation. So then, when there's that information gap, it breeds suspicion around preferential treatment, favouritism, etc. And that we also focus on the use of information, conflicts within the workplace, and bullying behaviours as well. So again, that's targeted at that middle management level that are uniquely involved in handling those matters on a day-to-day basis.
David, I notice you don't separate out council types, as in metropolitan compared to rural regional. Is that because you didn't collect that information? Because I wonder what that might tell us if you had that view or that layer to put across it.
Yeah, correct. We didn't break it down on metro versus regional versus remotes. It was broken down from employee tenure in the sector, so experience, and role within the sector, whether they're in back of house administrative, service delivery, remote working environments. So we broke it down into those sort of categories.
I was just going to pick up the issue of recruitment that David spoke to, and certainly that's consistent with the Ombudsman's report into Ballarat a couple of years ago. One of the things I note that respondents have indicated is they've identified training in education, particularly targeting senior executives and councillors. Did the report go into what type of training the sector might be lacking at the moment, or is it a case of more of the types of training that's already out there? What more can we be doing as a peak body to support the sector?
So nothing new in terms of what types of training is required. It's more the maintaining of a focus on the training, embedding it into the process of an employment cycle of someone within the council environment. So making sure the expectations, values are well known in the advertising of roles. Then the education of employees when they're inducted, or councillors when they're inducted, in terms of values, integrity, policy and processes. Making sure that it's an ongoing piece of work during the course of the employment within the council sector, the local government sector, and ensuring that the policies and processes are well socialised, as I said, across the organisation and with the employee during their entire life cycle.
And that's certainly something that's probably easier to control with the administration of council. Councillors, now that we do have the mandatory induction training, are required to undertake that. But beyond that, we do have examples where sometimes it's difficult to get the councillors back into the room to do some of that follow-up training that you've just outlined.
I think there's certainly been a much greater emphasis on that now than there was when I first was exposed to the sector many, many years ago. It's something that's talked about much more frequently. There's expectations that both the administration and the elected class are conscious of the policies around particular functions they perform and the ethics that are required, the values that are required in the execution of that role. Certainly, there's a focus on the councillor conduct principles as well, which again is something that's really evolved and strengthened over time. So I think that the awareness is increased, which is a good thing, but it's something that we can't rest on our laurels for want of a better term. It's something that has to be continually reinforced to guard against slippage. And now, one of the things about the perceptions of corruption within the local government sector is it's what people think, but they're generally based on something that's happening or has happened. So therefore, it can't be discounted, and it means that we have to be conscious and guard against corruption or improper conduct occurring again. And it goes to, I think when we started about, when we're talking about this report and the importance of it, it goes to the reputation of local government and more generally the trust in public institutions. We all know that the trust in governments and public institutions is something that is being challenged, and therefore it's up to each council to do everything they can to maintain that community confidence, to maintain that social licence with their community for which, and the municipality for which they manage, so that they can continue to deliver services, engage with the community, encourage investment and employment within the municipality, and essentially work for the community overall.
David, one of the elements of the report that struck me was this almost a disconnect between the officer level and the senior executive perception of how well set up the organisation is to resist corruption. I thought that was a little bit telling, and I wonder what it says to you and what we as a sector could do with that piece of information.
So that's not uncommon for other sectors as well. And a really good example of this, and I've seen it in many occasions when we talk about a speak up culture within an organisation. And often when you're talking to the CEO, or in some cases the councillors, but certainly the senior administration, they're of the view that they've got a fantastic speak up culture, that the process is there, and they encourage people all the time to come forward and talk about things that aren't right, even corruption. And then when you engage down into the organisation, you find it's a completely different story. And in fact, there's a recent example where a council came to us and said, we've got a secure line where people can report it, they can do it confidentially, and they can let us know of things that aren't right that's happening in the organisation. And we thought that's fantastic. And then when we delved into it a bit deeper, we found that no one actually monitored that line. So there were recorded messages from up to 18 months ago that no one had listened to. So you can have that disconnect pretty easily. You can have a process and a system set up, but if it's not tested and it's not actually operational, then it's not going to deliver the outcomes that you require. So often we see that disconnect. What can organisations do to fix it? Well, there's a whole bunch of things that can be done. First thing, it goes back to your policies and your systems, get the processes better down. Then it's about the education of them throughout the organisation. For the senior executives of an organisation and councillors, it is tone from the top. And we, you know, I think every time I speak to you, Chris, I might use this term, but the leadership of the organisation is so important. So you can't expect your organisation to act ethically if you're not acting ethically yourself. So again, that's something that we really encourage the senior executives to do. And again, talk about these issues, like include ethical decision-making as part of your normal practices. Talk to your team about championing those that call out wrongdoing or poor behaviour. To the extent possible, if you have an example where you deal with a matter or a person that isn't acting according to the organisation values, then let the rest of the organisation know when you've dealt with it, as I said, to the extent you can. So there's some simple things you can do to bridge that gap in the perceptions of the senior executive and the rest of the organisation.
It's so important what you say there, Dave. And of course, it starts at the councillor level, doesn't it? And that's why the code of conduct is so important, and the actual culture and I guess role modelling that the councillors themselves demonstrate. And then that's made even a little more complex with the CEO relationship with the councillor group. And we've talked about that many times and some of the tensions there. And you can see how easily then when things slip through the cracks at those levels, how the perceptions of the administration as you get further down into the organisation would be exactly as you've reported here. So how seriously has the sector responded to this report, or is it still too early to sort of comment on that?
Yeah, probably still a little early. But we've certainly had a great reaction in terms of the publication of the report and questions, how it's being embedded into the actual organisations and the way they're communicating the findings. And as I said, growing an ethical organisation, then I'm probably a little bit early to tell. But I go back to your point about the councillor role in leading by example, and that's probably, if I could make one point through this vehicle and to the councillor cohort, is always be mindful of how the councillor's behaviour is viewed within the organisation and externally from the organisation. Often I think that's overlooked by councillors. They might see their role as quite different, but they are seen as a leader of the organisation. They are setting the behavioural tone for the organisation, and it's incredibly important. They're conscious of that, and it allows the employees of the council to model that behaviour. So I think that's incredibly important.
David, it occurs to me, and you may have thought of this, it would be interesting to ask elected representatives a series of questions around perceived corruption and integrity risk to see how that aligns with the organisational perception. Have you thought of that?
Yeah, indeed. So coming out of the results of this survey, there was a number of questions we had, particularly that one around the introduction of the perception around council behaviour. So flipping that and targeting the councillors for their response was something we've considered and may well do for the next survey. And again, those results would be quite illuminating.
I agree, and that would certainly be something worth having a look at.
Thank you, David. It's an easy read, and I think it's required reading, and it should be required of all councils, audit and risk committees as well, for that to be considered and have that risk register overlay, I think, put across it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for David, and we will look forward to having you on a panel coming up in a couple of weeks, I think it is, along with the Chief Municipal Inspector, to talk about some of your observations of the sector over the past year, given it is the first year of a new council term, and the role of the agencies and where you work together. So looking forward to hosting you then, and I believe we're going to do that in a live panel format, so that'll be interesting also.
Wonderful, terrific. Look forward to it, Kathryn.
Very important topic. I think it raises possibly as many questions as it answers, Kathryn, and it's that conversation that I think just needs to be had on an ongoing basis across the sector.
Yes, and that's something that really came through during that discussion with David. The need for this conversation about embedding an ethical culture in councils is not a conversation that you can have too much of, and it's one that we must continue to keep talking about, continue to encourage that training and development. And we've talked before about the councillor group understanding that although they are elected representatives, and it is the voter at the end of the day who determines whether or not they will continue on council, as a person fulfilling that role, which has very specific and important legislative responsibilities, there is a personal responsibility for councillors, for all of us, indeed, in the local government sector, to ensure that we're always updating our knowledge and we understand what it does mean to set, and role model the types of behaviours we'd like to see in the sector from the very highest level down.
We hope you enjoyed that look back on one of the highlights of the year 2021 on VLGA Connect. There's more to come from our summer series Best of collection. I hope you can join us again soon.